Hello and welcome to another episode of the Emil podcast. Today I'm going to be interviewing Steph Georgiou. I hope I pronounced that name correctly, but Steph is a psychologist, a author of the book Food Jail, a foodie, a food enthusiast, and she works very closely with people who are struggling through body image issues, eating disorders, and a whole range of psychological conditions and considerations through a variety of means. She is an amazing communicator. She has a great following on the socials, including TikTok, Instagram, and she provides a lot of great short form, very quickly packaged psychological tips on those platforms. Today, we explored a whole range of things, male and female eating disorders, how they tend to experience throughout the lifespan, ADHD and binge eating disorder, dopamine system, splitting in BPD, borderline personality disorder, the different types of therapies that could be used for things like eating disorders, such as schema therapy or internal family systems therapies, or other types of practical strategies that people could get into. And we also explored what is regular, okay, important. We also explored what is considered non-problematic eating versus problematic eating. And we all even went down a few other rabbit holes that discussed things like addiction and food addiction and how that might be a little bit different, ending on how to be a psychology influencer. So we covered quite a range of different topics. So without any further hesitation, let's get into the episode. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you on board, and I'm really intrigued about the type of conversation that we're going to have today, because I got a ton of notes of the things that I may want to bookmark and talk about and that sort of stuff. But our conversations are always pretty organic, so we'll go from there. I can see that there's a door that's opened up behind you. This is amazing. I love it.
Sorry,
If you need to
my
close
dog
that door.
opens doors. Dog opens doors when he's scared, so he's just gonna sit here. But I'm so sorry. I hope that
you do not have to apologize. That's very human of us. I'm not going to get offended on that, and I'm sure our listeners will not get offended
All right,
about a door opening behind you. In any case, Stephanie, I want to start off with the most important question there is. What day of no caffeine are you on right now?
Oh, thank you for remembering. That's so nice. I'm on day 8 of no caffeine. So I am an avid caffeine drinker. I love coffee, love caffeine, but I decided to give it up for 2 weeks after advice from a kinesiologist, just to help with my energy levels and adrenals. Yesterday felt amazing. Today, it's okay. It's all right. But look, I'm getting there. I'm over the first week. But I think it just shows you that if you really want to do something and you have the right strategies, that you can do it, because it is hard. Are you drinking coffee right now?
I'm drinking coconut water. I didn't drink much.
Wow.
I don't drink much coffee during the week, but on the weekend, I kind of drink a bit of coffee because I enjoy the taste and that
Yes.
sort of stuff. But it's not a habit for me per se. But yeah, I wake up early in the morning, have a cold shower, and get ready for the day. So that kind of gives me my boost rather
Love
than
that.
a particular coffee, which my wife, I make a coffee for my wife every morning though. So that's the thing.
Oh,
I grind the beans and I extract and do all that sort of stuff. And the smell and doing all that, I enjoy it. I love it. But I just don't drink it every day. But yeah, tell me what was you said a kinesiologist recommended a couple of weeks off. What are the health effects, or what are the effects for cutting out coffee for a period of time?
yeah, I love the buzz. I love being high energy, having that buzz, having heaps of, go, go, go. But it got to the point where coffee wasn't doing that for me anymore. I was relying on it. I was waking up questioning, oh my gosh, how can I do this? I need coffee. I just felt so tired. And I knew deep down, Emil, I knew deep down I had to make a change, but I was extremely willful. And it sort of gave me that empathy and compassion of clients that we see that really struggle to change. And I didn't do it for a long time. This was instructions back in July. So just a little bit of history for those who don't know. I went through an eating disorder for 9 years. That's what brought me, I guess, to the psychology space. But part of that was I used to have a lot of caffeine in the form of pre-workout, diet pills, coffee, everything you can imagine. And that residual effect is impacting me now. And that's why I had to deal with it. Because even if you change a habit in your life, there's still that residual effect. It's kind of like COVID. We didn't feel the effects till it was all over. And 2 years on, we're still dealing with it. So for me, it was a health choice and also an energy choice and also a mental choice as well. I thought, you know what, if I can do this, it really is the last vice that I have, then I can do anything. So it means a lot to me that I've been able to get this far with it.
That's huge. It's huge. If going from one a daily drinker, and some people drink. I mean, my dad was drinking something like 6 to 8 coffees each day. Even before he would go to sleep, there'd just be no issue with him falling asleep because his body was just so acclimated to it. But the thing is, we develop these dependencies, and I mean, caffeine is a widest used substance, though it is not problematic as in terms of in comparison to alcohol, or if you're drinking it every single day, and other things like nicotine and cannabis and the rest of those. But it is the most widely relied upon substance that humans have to date, which is interesting. You could correct me on that if I say something that's not
No, you're
quite up to
right.
scratch.
1.6 billion cups of coffee are consumed per day, and it's not regulated, and people don't know how much caffeine they're having because it is really tricky to measure. You get a large coffee. I know when you go to Starbucks, if you ask for an extra shot, they're like, yep, so 4 shots. I'm like, what? No, what is happening? Because the servings are so large. And I've read that on average, you shouldn't have more than 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is actually quite excessive. That's still 4 cups of coffee or 10 cans of cola or something like that. And it still sounded so alarming to me. And look, whilst there's so many health benefits of caffeine, I think because it's not regulated, we don't know how much we're drinking, we don't actually realize the impacts that it can have on our health and our functioning and cognitive function when you do build that tolerance.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And you get to a point where you make a personal decision. Am I going to keep something? Am I not going to keep something? And move it from there. I've been blessed not to have that vice particularly, so I can enjoy a cup of coffee, but there are other vices that I'd be like, nah. I mean we were just talking before we started recording. I collect a bunch of books that I haven't read and probably will never read, but that doesn't stop me from kind of spending money. And I mean, you can't compare coffee with books, but unless you're pairing them. Yeah.
Yeah.
In any case, it's good to have you on board to have a discussion, because I wanted to pick your brain on your specialty around body image, eating disorders, the way that you work in that space. I mean, you've got a clinic called Mind Food Psychology, and I think that pretty much, actually, we can unpack that name, Mind Food Psychology, in terms of the things that you treat, you specialize in. Is there anything that our listeners ought to know about the type of stuff that you do in and what you specialize in, to kind of frame our discussion today?
I love that. No one's ever asked me that. And to be honest, I'm a person that just makes a decision. I don't think about things too much, which can be a double-edged sword because, you know, you make mistakes, but I get things done. So Mind Food Psychology, it was born pretty much before COVID. So I was doing a bit of online work. I really believed in telehealth, but back in 2019, it wasn't a thing unless you lived in Ararat or really far out, you couldn't access rebatable Medicare sessions. And there was a lot of guidelines around it. It could only be 2 of the 10 sessions, which I thought was ridiculous because telehealth's amazing. So I decided either way, I want to build an online telehealth clinic to help people who perhaps couldn't get to a clinic or had a really bad agoraphobia, OCD, clinical obesity, whatever it may be. And then COVID happened, and that just escalated it and allowed people to access this. And it honestly just untapped a whole range of people who probably wouldn't have sought mental health otherwise. And the name Mind Food Psychology, it sort of comes from my own brand, Mind Food Steph. I really believe in the connection between the mind, psychology, and the body because it is all linked. And I believe food plays a massive part in that and often gets overlooked, especially with eating disorders, because it's not something psychologists are trained in. You really do have to go out, do your own research. And I believe because dieting is so normalized and restrictive eating and diet culture, it often gets missed in psychology. So I wanted to make sure we weren't missing it.
I mean, the clinical aspects of food and food disorders or eating disorders are touched on, but I mean, the type of food to eat or how our relationship with food informs our move forward in our life. I mean, food is the thing that cultures gather around. Food, music, movement, this sort of stuff is a whole communal experience. And then when we have a experience with food that just doesn't serve us and that food controls our life rather than brings us together, it's a really important type of work that you do, Steph. And I think that's an important thing for us to focus in on today as well. You talk a bit about, well, you talk a lot about body image in terms of the type of work that you do and how you help people along their relationship with their own bodies. But this has stemmed from a bunch of your own personal experience, and you've written a book about your journey through your own eating disorder called Food Jail, which I will have linked in my socials before because I think it's a wonderful resource and it's just really well written. And for those of us who enjoy short chapters, and this is a really cool book to kind of jump on into. But in any case, tell our audience a little bit about your story. What brought you to where you are right now?
Yeah, and it is a very easy read. I wanted to make it easily accessible. And if you're listening, you can get it on Audible for free under a trial, so anyone can grab it. It started honestly as a journal. So many years ago when I was struggling with my eating, I'd gone to a photo shoot. I really wanted to be a model, as everyone does growing up. And a photographer made a comment about my body, said I looked quite bloated, that I shouldn't eat before a shoot. And that's when my dieting began and I started restricting my eating. I really wanted to lose weight. And on top of that, I did grow up in a Greek household. So there was always food, but my mom was always in diet culture because they didn't know any different. They grew up in the low fat era when those morning shows were always on advertising the new diet or the new exercise bike. And I just thought it was normal to eat low fat food and want to lose weight. And I saw my mom doing it and I thought I should do it too. And then it just got a bit extreme. And at school, I'd start to not eat in front of people and restrict. And then obviously you can only restrict for a certain amount of time and restriction leads to binge. And I would go on these crazy binges where I thought something was wrong with me. I'd get so panicked about it. I'd worry about weight gain. And then I started purging to try to get rid of it. And then again, tomorrow's going to be different. It's going to be a new day. I'm going to start my diet on Monday. I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard that. And it's this vicious cycle of trying to chase weight loss that just leaves you feeling so depleted, hopeless, and trapped.
And that's where the name comes from, that food jail, where you feel trapped, you're not able to escape from your current circumstances. You go into, I mean, not to give any spoilers around, but there's an excerpt on Kindle where give you access to a number of the chapters for anyone who's interested. But you do talk about the growing up in the family that you grew up in, Greek family. I mean, my background is Romanian, so there's always food around the corner when it comes down to when my Australian friends come over. They're surprised at the amount of food that's you've got your pre-food, then you've got your actual food, then you've got your post, and then you've got things that happen afterwards. It's a lovely experience. But in terms of this photographer and the comment at this in the book, you call him a greasy photographer, who poached you from the street, wasn't it? Or he was going around trying to get people to come and become models. Is that what?
Yes. And a lot of people probably know who he is. He's, I guess, well known for poaching people in the street, tells you that you could be a model, makes you pay for a really expensive photo shoot, which he does. He even offers to do your makeup. I did my own makeup. And then you're sort of left to your own devices. You don't get any work, and it really is a scam. And I did do research and Google, and there's so many comments saying that it is a scam. And I'm just wondering if things like this still exist. But if you're listening and you know who I'm talking about or what I'm talking about, know that there was lots of, I don't know if victims is the right word, but I guess lots of vulnerable women and men who, I guess, wanted this dream, would do anything for it, and ended up with an eating disorder.
And you talk, well, you've brought up women and men in terms of people who go through eating disorders. Though, what are the demographics around the differences, as far as you're aware or your experience treating women and men? What are the main differences between these and how they express themselves?
Yeah, really good question. And I think the type of eating disorder usually says a lot about what the person has been through. And I think the reason the statistics are more heavy for females is because it's underreported in men. It's not something men are going to come out and say most of the time, or it's a different type. So with men, we see more, I guess, muscle dysmorphia, wanting to be bigger, wanting to be super muscly, or there is binge eating, but binge eating usually doesn't come on its own. It's usually a symptom of something else, whether it's trauma, whether it's undiagnosed ADHD. But I think the statistic is because it's underreported in men, whereas I think with women, it's more commonly accepted to have an eating struggle. But there are definitely men out there who struggle with their eating, especially if they're in an industry like ballet or dancing or being a jockey or having to have a low body weight for your career. That can be a massive predisposing factor to developing disturbed eating.
Do you know what the research is around when these types of disorders tend to develop in kids, men, boys, girls, and how they kind of present throughout the lifespan?
Yeah, and it's actually sad because it's getting younger and younger. You know, kids as young as 6 and 7 are reporting body dissatisfaction, but in the DSM-5, usually the age of onset is in your 20s, essentially. But I think people can struggle with this their whole life and not get a diagnosis or not realize it's an eating disorder until 30s, 40s, and never get help for it.
How does one come to learn that their routine around eating and what they do with eating it becomes problematic? Is this something that this is just what I do versus this is actually problematic for me? What are the differences, or what are the signals for that?
Yeah, good question. So when, I guess, disordered eating becomes an eating disorder and there's a spectrum for it, it's when the behaviors really start to impair your day-to-day functioning. For example, all you're doing is thinking about food at work, You feel a bit out of control around food when you have binges. And look, it depends on the type of eating, but the main characteristic is when it's interfering with your day-to-day functioning. You avoid social situations, you avoid going shopping for clothes, looking in the mirror, you weigh yourself too much, or you weigh yourself not at all. There's frequent checkers, frequent avoidance. But essentially, when your pie chart of life is heavily based on eating, food, exercise, and the over-evaluation of your body weight, shape, and size.
Okay, fair enough. It's what if you don't notice that there's an issue, but somebody else is noticing there's an issue with you? Do you know much about the dynamic there, either in a marital relationship or a parent, parents with the kids and the rest of that?
Yeah, it's a real tricky one because eating disorders are very secretive, they're very competitive, and often they are very defensive. When someone with an eating struggle is confronted about it, if they're not ready to address it, they're likely to be very defensive, argumentative, and it's hard to tell someone you love. It's hard to tell someone you love that you think they may be struggling with eating, but some of the signs you might see include they're not eating at the dinner table with you. They're often eating in private. They're not eating large amounts. They may play with their food, push it around. For a binge eating disorder, you might find wrappers, food, lots of stored goods, flour, butter, things in the closet. People spending so much money. I've had people spend hundreds of dollars a week on binge food. So financially, it has an impact as well. And just social events, either avoiding eating or not going to social events, and constantly talking, thinking about food, being at the gym a lot. There can be some of the telltale signs that someone's struggling with eating. They eat very clean in public, but in private, there's wrappers everywhere. I mean, that's what it was for me.
Well, what happened? What was the transition for you when it came to noticing that you've this is just what I do versus this is becoming quite problematic for me?
For me, it got to the point where my binges and purges were affecting my cognitive capacity. I was so tired. And again, I was running on caffeine and energy drinks and pre-workout that I was actually driving home one night. So I opened a business. When I started my honors degree, I opened a pole dancing studio for fitness, which we'll go into in the book. And I was exercising a lot. I was teaching up to 6 hours of dancing a day. I would go to the gym on top of that. I'd do PT. And I was so exhausted. And I was driving home. And the guy in the car next to me was waving and waving. And I'm like, oh, great. Like, who's this sleaze? I just didn't pay attention to it. But then I looked and he's like, you are on the wrong side of the road. And I was literally driving about to have 5 lanes of oncoming traffic. And I was like, oh, crap. And I just did a U-turn. But that's when it hit me. I was so out of this world. It was almost dissociative, I'd say, where I was just out of it. I wasn't there. Even my mum would say to me, Steph, you've lost your sparkle. You've lost your shine. I was present physically, but mentally, I wasn't there. I was just somewhere else. I was in a food chat.
That's a good way of putting it. Were you able to carry yourself in a way that other people wouldn't notice that there was an issue? And yeah, okay, tell us about that. How did you manage to do that when inside you were just bleh?
Oh, on the outside, I was so high functioning. I was happy and positive and bubbly. And look, that is my personality. That is who I am. But I would never, I guess, want people to experience a crappy version of me. So I was always on. I always felt I wanted to bring people up, be that positive light. And because I was a dance instructor, people look up to you. People think, wow, I want to be able to do that trick or that pole trick or whatever it is. So there's this pressure, I guess, to look a certain way, but also have a certain presentation, especially when you're running a business. You can't just be like, I'm having a shit day. I'm not going to turn up. You know what I mean? So I would be very present and happy and out there on the outside. But I don't think I even realized how exhausted I was because I was just running on adrenaline. I was studying full time, working full time, go, go, go. I just kept busy from noticing what was really going on.
And then if you ever allowed yourself to be a bit demotivated or a little bit not running on those fumes, then people are like, Steph, you're not being your usual self. Or
Yeah.
and that I mean, I've had that. It's so interesting because you present in a certain way, and then anytime you're like, oh, I just want to relax a little bit or something or other, it's like there's a difference that's seen by others, and there's an expectation that you place on yourself. It's like, bloody hell, do I need to always put up a front, or do I, or is there something missing here? Um, interesting stuff. Is that what you found anyway? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, for sure. If you're not your bubbly usual self, people think there's something wrong, or people think there's, what's going on. But it even got to the point where I'd give my friends disclaimers like, hey guys, like I'm happy to meet today, but just letting you know I'm not as high energy as I usually am. And then I realized people don't care. They love you for you. They're happy to be there. But I think that's why after a long day of teaching dance classes, of eating super clean in public, because I had this dream of being shredded and I wanted to be a bodybuilder, and I joined this bodybuilding gym, and then I just go home and say, okay, I'm going to have a bit of chocolate. But what happens is in your eating disorder mind, you develop this thing called dietary rules. Rules such as, oh, chocolate will make me fat, shouldn't eat carbs at night, I need to fast till 12 o'clock. And it's when you break a dietary rule, that's when all hell breaks loose. And that perpetuates the cycle of eating disturbance as well.
So there's a real emotional reaction to breaking these rules, whereas someone who doesn't necessarily, they may be following a particular diet, but they can break that without feeling the emotional overwhelm. Is that a differentiating factor between someone who is struggling and someone who's not?
Yeah, and the main difference is the over-evaluation of weight, shape, and size. Someone who over-evaluates their worth in their weight or the impact of their size on their life, they're more likely to be distort when they break a dietary rule that's in their mind. Whereas someone who is just like, I'm a person living my life, whatevs when it comes to food, if they eat a donut, they'll just say, I ate a donut. Cool. And then they move on with life. Whereas someone who is in food jail and who over-evaluates the influence of weight, shape, and size on their worth will think, I ate a donut, it's so high in fat, I can't stick to anything, how am I ever going to lose weight? Then they feel horrible, they feel guilty, they feel bad. And what do we do when we feel bad? A lot of us turn to food.
Okay, and that is an interesting one because you have a depressive mindset that feels synonymous with. I'm not going to conflate the two, but I want to. When someone may have a negative thought, but the thing that differentiates someone with depression is that negative thought just spirals and then it becomes a self-statement. This is how I am, and I'm never going to be the person I want to be, and I'm never going to be able to live up, and everyone hates me, and therefore I should just die. This sort of stuff tends to spiral really quickly. Do you see something similar in a person who has an eating disorder in terms of that spiraling?
It's hard because, yes, depression can be comorbid with eating disorders or other mental health conditions. But people with eating disorders are very motivated. They're very driven. They're usually perfectionistic, and they won't allow themselves to listen to the depression. So even if they're exhausted and tired and think this is so hard, they're like, no, earn your food. You have to go. There's a part of their brain, the eating disorder part, that is critical, demanding, relentless, and that part tends to overpower every other part.
Do you know much about the neurobiology of what's going on in a person with an eating disorder compared to someone who has, say, a healthy understanding or relationship with food?
It's interesting because we see a high comorbidity between ADHD and binge eating disorder. And there's, I guess, theories around dopamine and the wiring of the brain And people with eating disorders, I remember reading, they actually experience more dopamine, more excitement when they eat sweet foods or when they have that. And I honestly think that's something I've experienced, because when I have dessert, when I have Nutella, I'm just like a pig in mud. I love it. It is the best time of my life. And I don't know if it's because I restricted it. I don't know if it's a dopamine thing, but they have found that sometimes people who do gravitate to binge eating as a strategy do have lower levels of dopamine sometimes. But whether that's linked to another mental health condition, it could be, we're not sure.
Well, dopamines are very, very important. I mean, I was taught for a very long time that dopamine is only associated with pleasure, whereas the more I looked into it, the more, and Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist at Stanford, talks a lot about this, that dopamine's more about motivating behavior
Yes.
rather than pleasure. Now, of course, motivating the behavior can lead to pleasure, but in terms of the dopamine release, it tends to be associated more with you're motivated towards something. It's like a drive towards something. Even uh, certain types of sea worms excrete dopamine when they sense food in the environment, because it motivates them towards that. And people with Parkinson's, for example, have an upset dopamine system, and therefore there's movement disorders or movement issues that tend to come up, and they can't move into where they need to be. It's very interesting to see that ADHD and binge eating disorder also has this type of consideration.
Yeah.
Tell me more about any other comorbidities that tend to come up in your clinical practice when a person's going through an eating disorder.
Yeah. And look, it's interesting because the people I see usually have a comorbidity or something else brings them to therapy. And on further inspection, they've got eating issues. But for me, I don't believe I had any other comorbidities. I think it was just straight eating for me. Maybe a bit of anxiety, but I think it was relative to what I was experiencing. I was running a business, I had a lot of stress, and I do think eating became a coping mechanism just to calm me down when I felt stressed. But what I see is a lot of ADHD and binge eating. I see anxiety, depression, low mood, and especially women who struggle to get pregnant, or they've been on this IVF journey, or they've never felt good enough in their body, good enough to get pregnant, good enough to achieve those goals, that they turn to food to self-soothe because they don't have a lot of fun in their life. We also see borderline personality disorder, massive one associated with eating challenges. In fact, usually eating disorders would get diagnosed previously, and then over time, they may get a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. But we see that a lot.
So for people who may not have much of an understanding of BPD, borderline personality disorder, and how it relates to an eating disorder, can you just explore what is borderline personality disorder and how what are the main kind of parallels between that?
Yeah, sure. So borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder, which means it's pervasive, it doesn't really go away, and it's a combination of dysregulation in a number of areas. So people with BPD struggle to have a strong sense of self. They don't really know who they are, and they struggle to regulate their emotions. So the 4 areas of dysregulation we see is emotion dysregulation, going from 0 to 100. We see cognitive dysregulation, having very rigid thinking patterns, black and white thinking, splitting. People are either really good, really bad. We see behavioral dysregulation, self-harm, comorbid substance use, alcohol use, suicidal ideation, and then interpersonal challenges. And that's probably the biggest telltale sign of someone with a personality disorder, is their relationships and friendships are often turbulent and very up and down.
And if we were to just stay on the relationship side of things and the attachments to other people, we tend to see there are some, okay, there tend to be some pretty marked differences with people who have BPD and their attachments to, say, their caregivers growing up, or their ability to feel connected, to feel like they belong. In later relationships, it could also be reflected there. If our caregiver relationships form the template of how ongoing relationships in our life tend to look like. When we think about romantic relationships and people with, uh, say, ADHD or an eating disorder, now, because these are two separate questions, do you tend to notice any marked issues in these romantic relationships in these situations?
Yes, it's interesting because I think depending on the diagnosis or what they're experiencing, and look, not every case is the same. There are people with BPD who are in long-term relationships, but as long as the person is getting therapy and they're managing it, I think that's a different story. But if it's unmanaged borderline personality disorder, relationships can feel quite toxic. There's a push and pull. They engage in what's called splitting, which means 1 minute the person is the most amazing person in the world. They put them on this pedestal, and then if the person does something bad, then they're put in the bad box. They're devalued, because people with BPD struggle to see two differential qualities in the same person, that someone can have good qualities and bad qualities. They're either good or bad. And then because the ability to regulate your emotions when you're feeling upset, when you're feeling sad, and then engaging in behavior, which is not only risky, but problematic, that puts a lot of stress on both parties, because they can get angry, they can, engage in self-harm, a lot of that. And if you don't understand BPD, it can be really tricky as well for the other person to manage, especially if the partner is invalidating, which is a massive, massive trigger for people with BPD.
Because they need to feel, well, everyone needs to feel accepted, like they belong somewhere. And if they're in a relationship where they're not getting that, then it just amplifies their attachment fears and just makes things even worse.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And especially if you've grown up and you haven't seen a healthy relationship modeled between your parents, then you don't really know any better. And sometimes you can attract what you're familiar with.
Mm. And it really does take a very motivated individual to have a look at themselves, to become more and more self-aware, and to make those changes. If there's no ability to do that, or if they haven't been able to do, no, well, this is where I've come from, this is where I am right now, and this is how it's affecting me, then to your earlier point, it makes it very difficult in a relationship to balance and to manage.
Yes, yes. Awareness precedes change. And if people don't have that psychological awareness or that desire or that motivation to change, change is very difficult, as I'm sure you know that as well from the work that you do.
It's an interesting one. I read what you said, um, reminds me of a uh, psychoanalyst back in, I think he was writing in the 80s or 90s. He said, his name is Alan Wheelis, and he said that back in Freud's time, people didn't have much awareness in why they were the way that they were. And so psychodynamic therapies tended to fill that gap, where they would become aware of the reasons why they were the way that they were. And because their culture at that time, the Victorian culture, valued self-control, valued discipline. They were very emotionally rigid, and they were able to be very driven to the things that they needed to do. That awareness preceded change, and change tended to happen very quickly. Now,
Mm.
he also makes the point, though, that these days our culture doesn't necessarily value discipline as much as they did back in the day. Everything is all here and now and at the click of a button, and we tend to think more of what we're feeling right now, but we have all the awareness that we need. And change tends to happen a lot slower in comparison, in response to therapeutic interventions. I thought that was a very interesting, I don't know how we would measure that, but I thought that was a very interesting highlight that he had. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, wow. I think you're right. With everything we have around us, our mobile phones, access to dopamine inducing activities all the time, I think as well, change is so hard and awareness is challenging, whereas avoidance feels good. It feels good to sometimes not feel the pain. But for people who struggle with that, when the pain of staying the same gets more than I guess, the pain of changing, that's when they're ready to say, okay, I need to address this. But I can see why change would take longer now, because we have so much distraction. We have so much access to avoidance that why change?
And yet we have some of the best clinicians, some of the best research out there, some of the best access to professionals who can make that change. Back in Freud's day, there was what, Freud, and you had what was his buddy's name, Jung, in that time. Yeah. So definitely not as much exposure, but even before Freud, it was Breuer, Joseph Breuer, which was actually interesting. Looking into, I don't know how read you are with Irvin Yalom. Have you read much of Irvin
Yeah.
Yalom's work?
Yeah, I
He
have.
he wrote a book called When Nietzsche Wept. Did you read that book, or where was his other?
No,
Okay,
not
it's a fictional account of Friedrich Nietzsche going to see Joseph Breuer,
that.
who was actually Freud's mentor, and it's a historical fiction. So he's kind of imagining what would happen if Nietzsche met Breuer and got some counseling back in the day. And it was actually Breuer who came up with the talk therapy. But he only did it on one person, and it was Freud who just carried the baton. It was actually Freud
Yeah.
and Breuer who wrote the book on Anna O. You'll be interested to, you might have remembered throughout undergraduate, they
Yes.
they talked about Anna O. Bertha Poppenheim was the real name of that lady, but she had a lot of hysterical symptoms back in the
Mm.
day. Now that happens from a somatic point of view, and these days, even though we have conversion disorder, we're seeing a lot more of eating disorder in comparison to those sorts of things, because they all happen within the body. To kind of redirect our conversation from that rabbit hole to your experience, how would you say the body from a somatic point of view is impacted, or in regards to an eating disorder? So whether that's anxiety, trauma based responses, or while you're eating, or binging and purging, what are a person's relationship with their body? What is it like, and how do you conceptualize that?
So when we talk about somatic or bodily sensations and the relation with eating disorders, it's dependent on the person, right? Because some people may be aware of what their body is feeling or what they're experiencing, and they may develop that awareness throughout therapy. But essentially, I think when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to ADHD, when it comes to worrying about what you ate, obviously the nervous system is activated. Your fight or flight response is set off, which sends cortisol, adrenaline, those stress hormones. And those stress hormones either make you lose your appetite or make you want to eat. And I think people are just trying to stop the discomfort. We've grown up wanting to stop bodily sensations, whether it's bad or whether it's feeling upset. As a young child, we're always told, oh, don't worry, just have an ice cream, don't cry, don't cry. So I think when it comes to discomfort in our body or somatic symptoms, we're very quick to want to shut that off rather than become curious about it. And I think that's what perpetuates the cycle, the disordered eating, the eating disorder, the binge eating, is because people are trying to minimize or address that discomfort. And people have different ways of addressing the discomfort. In health anxiety, there's doctor seeking and checking and Googling your symptoms. Whereas if you're someone who has a lot of stress or anxiety, it may be binge eating to deal with it.
I love what you said. We're shut off instead of curious. Can we linger on that point just for a moment?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Why do you suspect these days people are more shut off from feeling what they're feeling?
No one wants to feel uncomfortable anymore because we don't have to. Oh, feeling lonely, jump on Tinder. Feeling upset and sad, jump on Milk Run or Uber Eats. We don't have to feel negative emotions. There's a really good book on this. It's called Dopamine Nation, and it just talks about our relentless pursuit. But it's a really delicate balance that actually can harm us more than anything. But think about yourself. Think about, when's the last time you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation? Like, I know you have cold showers every morning, and that does actually build up your resilience and leads to a process of hardening, which means you're able to deal with more stress in the everyday world more effectively. But if you're listening to this, just reflect on, when's the last time I felt discomfort and really sat with it and observed it and noticed it and didn't try to shut it off. Even when you're at the gym, I'm like, oh my God, this is so painful. This hurts so much. I'm like, no, I have to remind myself, this is good. This pain is good. Muscles are growing. I think that's what it is. We want to shut off unpleasant sensations.
This is an interesting one, Steph, and if we can linger on it for a little bit more, because I think it's easier for, I'll speak for myself. It's easier for me to deal with body discomfort than emotional discomfort.
Wow.
So, and I'm a psychotherapist, which is
Mm.
very interesting. So when it comes to emotional discomfort, there's a vulnerability there that I don't experience when I mean, I do jujitsu as well. So grappling sport, I'm getting choked out. I can deal with that, I can deal with a cold shower no matter how difficult it is. But it takes a lot more work to deal with an emotional issue or an emotional upset than the others. And I find that interesting
Mm.
in the type of work that I do. But I think the way that translates well into the work that I do is I tend to be able to, when I'm counseling clients, I tend to be able to connect with them in a way that I don't adopt their feeling, in a sense that I'm not being swallowed up by their feeling, or I take their feeling home, or their experience home, or their traumas home. And that's interesting to kind of look at. What are your thoughts around? Now, I know we're not going to psychologize one another, unless of course you want to. In the end, what's your sense of people who may have these difficulties with emotional compared to physical, versus and are more comfortable with one versus the other?
That's so interesting. I haven't really thought about it. I think it comes down to your upbringing and your experience with emotions, whether you grew up in a family who spoke about emotions and shared and validated and were okay with that, versus if emotions weren't spoken about, or if your family dealt with them with alcohol or drugs. It's definitely more challenging to regulate your emotions more effectively and deal with emotional baggage, because it does take a level of reflection and awareness and work that is really easy to avoid. And this is something I've sort of honed in on this year is when I feel upset or triggered, I notice an urge to go have something to eat, go make a coffee, go distract. But when I actually ask myself, hey, you're actually feeling upset and triggered, what is this really about, Steph? What is this really about? And when I dig deep enough, I was like, whoa, okay, that's where it's coming from. But I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, it's not that you didn't answer the question. I think you've explored it in one facet. My follow-up question would be around uh, whether the stress is related to attachment. So let's use your example where you feel a particular way and you feel an urge to make a coffee or have something to eat. Is is it different when it's an attachment hurt versus when it's a, I don't know, graze my knee hurt and now I want to I don't know, make myself feel better in that way? I mean, I know that's a crude example, but do you notice that there's any differences in that
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, for sure. I think the solution is simple when it's physical. Either I stop or I'll bandage my knee. The solution is there. Whereas the solution is harder when it's an emotional trigger, because you either need to change the way you think about it or change the situation. And that can be really tricky if you're hardwired in your cognitive thoughts and you're not willing to change and reflect on that. Then sometimes it's, yeah, the situation that has to change and you don't really learn or grow from it.
Fair enough. That's a good way of looking at it. I'm doing a bit more of a deep dive into therapies like emotion focused therapy and internal family systems therapies, which it's all about identifying parts of yourself
Yes.
that are feeling a particular way. And when we are, all right, so an example would be, and this sounds, it probably sounds stupid, but when I'm having a cold shower, I imagine a part of me that is represented by someone that is in popular culture and is like, go ahead, do it, you can do it, and that sort of stuff, where I can actualize that part and I can go, okay, well, I'm gonna listen to this part of me and this part's gonna help me through it. And then I notice that there's other parts of me. It's like, get the hell out of the shower, get the hell out of here right now. And then it's like, okay, well, what are you scared of? I'm not going to die. I've done this a ton of times before. Can just take a step back and I'll stay with this other part that's actually going to help me through. Same with any, now that's, I have to be very mindful to do that. By no means will our listeners think that I do that in every element of my life. I'm not that well controlled, but I can get into moments where I can navigate this mental terrain a little bit better. Uh, how, to apply that to, actually, I'll let you respond to any of that, and then
Yeah.
yeah.
I love parts work. I recently did a schema therapy training course, and it's so helpful to look at yourself in parts, because we all have parts that develop for reasons that come up in certain seasons. And I can relate to that too. I definitely have this part of me that can get activated that maybe, around diet culture or eating a certain way, and which I keep at bay. But everyone has different parts that can be activated at different times. And those parts are often linked to an early maladaptive belief or an early adverse life experience as a child. And then what happens is we develop these modes to cope. So, say, for example, we've all got a healthy adult part. This is the part that comes to therapy. This is the part that's like, hey, I really want to give up my drinking or my substance use, whatever it is. And then when that person is activated, if they have a stressful event, if they don't manage that, that healthy adult part can go out the window, and they're hijacked by what we call coping modes. So we have the demanding parent mode, which is like, you should do this, you shouldn't stay in the shower, or you deserve this, whatever it may be. And then we also have, different child modes, vulnerable child mode. But we want to build our protective modes, and we want to build the healthy adult mode to be able to mitigate and negotiate with these parts when they're activated.
And that's very, very unique to schema therapy, but there are some parallels with I mean, I don't call it internal family systems or IFS anymore. I just call it parts therapy, because my clients can kind of conceptualize parts a little bit better than
Yes.
IFS acronym or something or other. Do you know much about IFS and the way that hand addresses parts?
I am familiar with it through EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a therapy for trauma. We mimic eye movements and we do some parts work in that. And there's some internal family system, I guess, overlap with that. And schema therapy is similar. So schema, like you said, internal family system should be called part therapy. I think schema should be called needs therapy because it's all about unmet needs. And unmet needs essentially turn into parts. So if you have an unmet need of affection, attention, and love as a child, maybe you have either this grandiose, narcissistic, self-entitled part that's afraid people are going to abandon you or reject you. So you have this facade of being over the top or being demanding or being critical, whatever it might be. So parts, I think, develop out of unmet needs.
That's really, I love that. I love that conceptualization, Steph. Thank you. I got a clip there. But I think the way that you put it, parts versus needs, that's important. I never thought about it. Schema therapy, of course, now in hindsight, everything becomes obvious. But when I'm looking at schema therapy, I didn't conceptualize it as a needs therapy in the same way that IFS I conceptualize as a parts therapy. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that one.
Well, why do you think parts develop in internal family systems?
Exactly why you highlight it, because we have an unmet need that we feel like needs to be, well, it needs to be met. And if we're too overwhelmed, it needs to be attenuated in some way. Um, that's but yeah, like I said, hindsight is 2020. But when you're conceptualizing it, this is a really good way to conceptualize it, Steph. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I think people relate to it. They can relate to it and they can understand it and it's easy. And look, not everyone has unmet child needs that they're aware of, but even just adverse life experiences that you don't think are a big deal, but they do have an impact. And I think that's something we see a lot is people don't think that certain life experiences have had a lasting impact on you until someone actually says, hey, that was actually domestic violence, or hey, that was actually neglect, or that situation really explains why you're this way. So I think we can minimize our own experiences and the impacts they have.
It's a really good place to focus in on. There's so many different routes that we can take here, because we started off talking about eating, body image, and now we're kind of conceptualizing things from a grander scale. What makes up a human, and how do we bring ourselves to the table and move forward in life that way. If I were to just curtail it back to the eating disorder just for a moment, and when we think about binging and purging and the cycle that we get into there, number one, how do we acknowledge that has become a cycle? And number two, what do we do about it? What are the practical implications there?
Yeah, so I think if you're someone who is consumed by thoughts of food, body image, your weight, your shape, your size, to the point it's interfering with your life, either you don't go out on dates because you think people won't like you or you're too fat, you limit what you eat, you binge eat on the weekend, you purge, you excessively take laxatives, you excessively exercise, you are never happy with your body and your appearance, that's definitely not okay. You shouldn't have to live like that. And a place to start really is to ask deep questions about yourself. And this is something I had to do for me. And it was very life-changing because everyone has this number. Oh, I just want to get down to 60 kilos. I just want to get down to 75. But when I actually question people, because the quality of your questions dictate the quality of your life and your outcomes, they don't have good enough answers. They don't actually have answers. Why 65? What is it about that number? You know, when you go to a gym or you follow a training program, they're always like, okay, what's your goal? And the first goal you think of is, okay, a weight goal. But why? What will that weight give you that you can't have now? Why can't you be more confident now? Why can't you work on your confidence in conjunction with health-related behavior? And you've got to really ask yourself, what will weight loss give me that I can't have now? And yes, I understand sometimes people do have a medical need to lose weight. And I think that's the other sort of ballpark of clients I work with. But you can't lose weight out of an eating disordered mindset. They're two opposing goals. And I remember I was sitting in a psychotherapist's office once, and he said to me, Steph, you've got your foot in two camps. You want to be a bodybuilder, but you want to be a psychologist. You know, do you think they're both aligned? And I'm not saying that psychologists can't be bodybuilders, but I had an eating disorder at the time, which doesn't align with either goals. So you have to fix that first.
So asking these questions, what is this giving me, or what am I going to get from getting to this particular weight? What if a person has developed, I mean, they're so into that routine. Are there any practical strategies that aren't cognitive, that are more routine based, that are more, this is what you do if you feel an urge to eat, or if you feel an urge to purge or binge or what have you? Any practical strategies that a person could use in those situations?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing to do is eat regularly. So we stabilize their eating, first of all, because people who engage in binge eating, they're very sporadic. They usually don't eat, they'll fast. We want 3 meals and 3 snacks, or 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks. That's the first goal. We don't care what you eat or how much you eat, but we just want to bring regular eating back into your life. So letting go of this desire to restrict, letting go of this desire to modify your weight, be all in with recovery. And I know that's scary because people fear weight gain, but at the end of the day, dieting and yo-yo dieting is going to make you gain weight. So you have nothing to lose than to heal this. So the practical strategy is regulate your eating. If you do have an urge to splurge, it's okay. We don't want to demonize binge eating or emotional eating, because emotional eating can be very healthy, can be very functional, as long as it's not your only coping mechanism. But diet culture has demonized emotional eating. So if you have a binge, if you emotionally eat, it's okay. Forgiveness, self-compassion goes so much further. The research has shown when you're kind to yourself, when you're self-compassionate, you actually hit your goals, you hit your deadlines, versus someone who pokes himself with a stick. Like, you shouldn't have eaten that, you should be doing this, you should work harder. So being okay with binges and using them to learn. I can learn from this binge if I'm not criticizing myself over it. Come at it from a place of curiosity, from a place of kindness and wanting to learn about it. Okay, what triggered this off? Let's have a look. Let's sit down. Let's analyze this. So rather than being in the emotion, step back and actually deconstruct what happened here and how can I address it next time in a different way.
I see that there's a potential to use parts language here. That there's a part of me that feels driven to eat right now. Is there any other part of me that feels like there's another option here? Do people ever do that, or people can?
All the time. So you can say, you know, the eating disorder part, or whatever you want to call it, Patricia, whatever, really wants me to do this right now. And you got to ask yourself, you know, what does this part of me need? What do I really need right now? Oh, maybe I need sleep. Maybe I need a break. Maybe I need to talk to a friend. And more often than not, when you want to eat, when you're not hungry, it's driven by something else, but we don't give ourselves enough time to figure out what that is. It's just like, oh, got an email from my boss, and then you're in the pantry. It's very unconscious.
Yeah, do you get to a point where you're doing something without even realizing how you got to doing it?
I think so. I think you can have good intentions where you're like, oh, I'm going to have a snack. And then a bag of Doritos later or a block of chocolate later, whoops.
Yeah, that's all right. That's really interesting. Yeah, speaking with, I mean, someone who has never struggled with an eating disorder, I'm learning a lot here, and trying to figure out how because the process is synonymous with other ways that I approach therapy. For example, in addiction, though of course there are different nuanced and important differences there. Actually, are there very important differences between a person with an addiction and a person with an eating disorder? Well, what's the sense there?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up because, especially in America, they're very big on food addiction and everyone, has got an addiction to sugar and food and all that. The difference between addictions and food or eating disorders is you need food to live. You can't just give it up like alcohol or drugs or substances. You actually need to eat, which makes it complicating because it's not an addiction you can just quit or give up. Can you be? And people will say this to me, oh, I'm just addicted. I'm addicted to the feeling. I'm addicted to this. But I think it's more a habit and it becomes easy, especially if you've purged for a long time. It becomes a reflex that you don't even have to force it. It just happens. And I think people can definitely get addicted to sugar or caffeine or parts of it. But are eating disorders addictions? I don't think they are. Maybe people get addicted to the feeling or the relief that they get once they purge, but I don't think it fits in the addictions category, for example, in the DSM-5.
Yeah. I mean, they're completely different sections of the book, and with the DSM, you've got things like substance abuse disorder or methamphetamine use disorder or what have you. But there's no, from my understanding, there's no I don't know, carbohydrate use disorder or something of the
Yeah,
maybe in the next one, maybe in the next one there'll be
maybe in the
something.
DSM-6. The other thing I was going to say is the criteria for an addiction is that you essentially can't function without it or you build a tolerance to it. Whereas I just don't see that in food. It's not like, oh man, I've really got to have my binge today or I'm not going to function. If something gets in the way, you don't binge, but your life isn't dramatically changed. Your nervous system isn't, it's not like if you don't have alcohol, you get delirium tremors or you get that physiological effect.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I've had clients who have stopped using a substance and then they started to eat a lot
Mm.
afterwards, and they develop what they call an addiction to food, and then they put on a ton of weight, and then but they haven't transferred to the point that they've developed an eating disorder such as or maybe they have. I just haven't asked them the question. I don't know. Maybe I need to ask the
You know
question.
what's interesting though? Do you think, especially in a male population, because I assume you work with a lot of males, is it more socially acceptable to say I have a food addiction versus I have an eating disorder? I have an addiction to food. It's not me, it's the addiction.
Yeah, and I think that even just the conversation, I've got an addictive personality, that covers
Oh,
everything. It's like
yes.
I'm like, there's no such thing as an addictive
Do you believe
personality.
it? Do you
So
think there is or there isn't? I feel like I grapple with this as well.
I think personally, all right. So I'm not going to look at personally about what my mood's telling me there is or there isn't. I don't see the evidence to argue that there is an addictive personality. I think there are addictive parts to a person's personality, but an addictive personality, no, I don't think that there is an all-encompassing. Now, why would I say this? I have to look at the data. I have to look at what makes up a personality. The best conceptualization of a personality we have are the big five personality traits. Now, of course, so for those who aren't aware of the personality traits, best acronym is OCEAN. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is also named bad emotion or negative emotion or what have you. Now, in what part of that personality conceptualization does addiction lie? You could say that openness to experience may predispose a person to do experientially important things that lead to them developing an addiction, or neuroticism leads to overwhelming feelings that make a person more likely to experience an addiction. Is there an addictive personality? I'm not convinced that there is an addictive personality. I think maybe a person is so blended to a particular part of themselves, and that part is so undifferentiated that they see themselves as that part. And I think this is where IFS, that this parts therapy, can become really important, where you differentiate these different parts and say, okay, yeah, there is a part of me that struggles with addiction, but there is no addictive personality. Thank you for asking the question, because it's helped me think through that as well.
No, I feel I'm in two minds. I feel when I'm not in psychologist mode, I'm like, oh, it's just a cop out. Like, it's just easy to say, I have an addictive personality, give me all the drugs. But then in therapy, I think, and my hypothesis on it is that people are vulnerable to addictions. People have a vulnerability to having, quote unquote, an addictive personality. They're vulnerable to it because maybe they have undiagnosed ADHD and they're self-medicating, and then they think, well, I just have an addictive personality. I love caffeine, I love methamphetamines, give me all the stuff. But there's an underlying vulnerability they're not aware of that makes them more susceptible to choosing the addiction pathway, whereas it's not a personality, it's not who they are, it's a vulnerability. So I agree with you in that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's semantics, perhaps, where we're just like we're calling it one thing or another, but I think it becomes destructive in the same way that the word addict becomes destructive in 12-step programs. For example, I have an issue with somebody calling themselves an addict, and I work with people who have had tons of addictions, and that's one of my bread and butter, that I help people through that. And I don't like the conceptualization of I'm an addict, or even when I'm not using a substance. I think that it conflates the part of you that struggles with this, to use your words. There's an underlying vulnerability there. I think it conflates that with who the person is.
Yes, for sure. And it just gets easy to just lump yourself in that category. Oh, I'm an addict, I have an addictive personality, that's just who I am. And I think it prevents people from being able to change.
Yeah, and in fact, people, I think Roy Baumeister did a bit of work around this, the social psychologist, and he wrote a book on willpower, which is very interesting, about the concept, the psychological concept of willpower, which basically the concept of willpower is that popular concept, but the way that they study it is self-regulation. So how much is a person able to regulate their behavior in light of temptation? So grabbing a hand grip and squeezing the hand grip, and even though their brain's telling them you got to let go right now because you're too tired, your mental ability to hold on to it, even though everything's telling you to, or in the cold shower, another example. So you can actually measure self-regulation in terms of how a person is able to regulate their behavior. But what he said in one of his papers, I spoke with him a few years back. He sent me a paper that was focusing on the concept of addiction, and he mentioned that people who define themselves as having a brain disorder in relation to addiction tend to be a lot less uh, motivated to change because they see themselves as suffering from an affliction rather than having an ability or a potential towards mastery of that action. And this is where that brain disease model of addiction becomes quite hairy because it is a very popular model. And in fact, it's the model that drives 12-step programs. And when a person just glues themselves to the I have a brain disease, then what we see is that even when they're not using a substance, they're still what AA would call dry drunks. They're still doing everything the same as they would usually be doing, but they're just not drinking alcohol.
I want to talk about that. So, do you believe that a person who was previously an alcoholic or someone who's overcome an addiction to alcohol, do you think sobriety is the answer? Because I've asked this to people and they're like, yeah, like there's something just with alcoholism. They just can't touch it. They can't stop. Do you think a person who struggles with alcoholism can ever get to the point in their life of having one drink?
I think, okay, so my experience, and this is again, I'm going to base this off my clinical experience and of the data that I've come across. I think there are certain varieties of people who use alcohol, as I'm sure you do. There are people who have a predisposition towards alcohol use but never use alcohol, and there are people who have a predisposition towards alcohol use, and you can think about from an epigenetic point of view, that genetic predisposition, and then they use alcohol. It's often within this demographic that these individuals can become more and more addicted and chronically use a particular substance. Now, I tend to approach treatment in a few ways. I usually try to do some psychological and behavioral interventions when a person's coming up to me. Okay, let's try this. And if this doesn't work, let's try this. And if this doesn't work, let's try this. And so we try to resource people and try to work people and taper people down from their substance use. If a person is having a high level of difficulty to taper down on their own, then they need some additional help, like a detoxification program or a residential rehabilitation program. In those situations, the brain generally takes between 2 to 6 months, from my understanding, for the brain to begin to change the neural networks that are laid down early on in alcoholism. Later on, it's almost impossible to change those neural networks after the 6-month period, even if you've stopped. Now, does that mean that things get better? Yes, things get better. They don't necessarily get worse, but that's to say that those neural networks tend to be laid down. And so to make this as simple as possible for our audience who might not be understanding your brain basically changes to anticipate a drink or something. You have a particular feeling. You're like, oh, I need to have a drink. I'm going to a pub with the boys. Let me just have a drink, or I'm doing what have you. Now, in those individuals, I would say the evidence that I've come across says, yes, these are the individuals that I think should not go back to drinking, even one drink, because it reactivates the same neural circuitry. And I facetiously talk to my clients about I'd say, imagine you've cheated on your spouse for a few times, and you're like, nah, I'm gonna stop. I'm going to stop. And then you test yourself and say, okay, I'm going to test whether I've really stopped. So I'm going to go and cheat on my spouse just to make sure that I've really stopped cheating on my spouse. It tends to be that I see people who tend to have, I'm going to stop using alcohol when I've had such an issue with it. And now I'm going to test myself by using alcohol again. And then they go back to the same spiral.
Right.
Now, I'm being facetious when I say that, but I think the concept is, to highlight concepts, I usually go into extremes. So I'm like, think about it this way. What do you think about this? So to answer your question, I think there are some people that need to move forward in their life and arrange themselves in such a way that alcohol is just not part of their life anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
But is that for everyone? No, I don't think it is for everyone because, I mean, alcohol is a poison. The way that it transfers into the body, in the liver, it actually gets transferred into a carcinogenic compound that is significantly more harmful than ethanol. And it actually burns muscle and cell fibers inside the body. So that's, I mean, it's an interesting process.
It's so normalized as well. I find alcohol similar to caffeine, it's extremely normalized, and I hardly drink. And this year, I've really just stuck to that. And you notice how many people are, you know, dumbfounded by the fact you don't drink or you don't want to have a drink. It's almost you're the weird one. Why aren't you drinking? Or why don't you drink? And I'm like, bro, do you know what it's doing to your brain?
Yeah. Do you know what I do? When someone says that, I actually so so if they keep pushing it to me, I'm like, why is it so important to you that I drink?
Mm.
So I just turn it back on them because in my experience, when I say, oh, but this is what's going on, this is what's going on, that just doesn't work, you know?
Yes.
So you're trying to convert
Yes.
someone who, yeah. But I'm just like, why is it so important to you that I drink? Like,
Yeah.
oh,
And
well,
I always, yeah, I think as well, reflecting on why are you drinking? What's your reason? I think the intention says a lot about the person or about what's going on for them or in their life. And I think if you're listening to this, I don't want to demonize drinking. It's fine in moderation. I'd like a glass of wine with steak or something like that, but it's not something I would intentionally choose to pursue in my life
mm.
unless it had a real specific intended purpose with it.
That's a good way of looking at it. What is the reason why you're using a particular substance? What's the reason? You go back to it when you think of eating disorders. Why is 65 kilograms so important for you? Why is this your thing? Turning the question to just allow someone to think about, well, what do I get out of this? It was an interesting uh, strategy that I came across, and it was a guy who Charisma on Command is his YouTube channel, and he goes through the psychology of becoming more confident, and I think this is very good for people who need to develop in their confidence and build their esteem, and he's got a lot of videos around using the psychology around that. He said that when he quit drinking, he found that people were asking him to drink or why aren't you drinking, and what he did to that, what strategy he found to be helpful is he said to them, I'm gonna match your energy level without drinking. If you're afraid of me not getting into things, I'm gonna match it, and then I'm gonna up it some. All right, I'm gonna do better than you are without drinking than I would with drinking. Is that gonna be an issue for you? Because often people are like, oh, you're gonna miss out, or you're
Yeah,
or they want you to drink because they're drinking, or what have you. I think this is an interesting one. But what are your thoughts around uh, all of this?
Yeah, I think, look, we live in a culture where drinking is extremely normalized. I think we don't talk about the dangers it has, the impacts it has, the effects that it has, and people just unaware of it. So they continue to drink. Me personally, I just don't really see a point to it unless, yeah, I'm having a glass of wine with a really nice meal or whatever it might be. But I would usually go out. I'll be at a restaurant. It's not something I do at home. If there's anything, I'd prefer dessert over drinking. But I think if you're listening to this, we're not demonizing alcohol or alcohol use, but just reflect on, why am I doing this? What is my intention behind it? Is it adding to my life in any way? Because you don't have to drink if you don't want to.
And that you may be the type of person who just doesn't enjoy the taste of alcohol, or just doesn't enjoy. There are some people who have a genetic disposition against alcohol. So they drink something and it actually makes them feel sick, and that's okay too. It's okay to have a reason why you're not doing as much as you have a reason why you are doing something that you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm. Uh, Stephanie, do you have? I want to ask you a few questions on influences. Now, you've developed a bit of uh, a presence in the social sphere, and I love the type of content that you put out. As I've told you before, you make psychology interesting, short, digestible chunks of uh, psychological themes. Uh, there are there are not many psychologists or psychotherapists who do it well.
Mm.
So my question for you would be, if you are a psychologist or a psychotherapist listening to this, uh, what are some of the tips you have for any people who want to get some word out on the socials? What does it take to be a psychological influencer, and how do you navigate that? Do you have any thoughts to share?
I have lots on this topic. So Instagram started as a food journey. So when I was recovering from my eating disorder, I really love food. I'm a massive foodie, and I started just posting food on Instagram. That took off in 2015 when photos and Instagram were the thing. And then I slowly just started increasing my content. I'd go on stories a lot. And back then, stories weren't a thing. So stories is when you talk to the audience, and talking to the camera wasn't common then. It was very new, it was very new age, but I believe that stories was where it was at. That's how you built rapport with people, that's how you developed your connection to your audience. But then I sort of should have put more videos online or on Instagram, but now there's reels, and you really have to evolve with the times. TikTok, on the other hand, was purely psychological. I went a little bit viral just doing a video on Married at First Sight, just my thoughts. And I was so reactive. I didn't have makeup on. I'm pretty sure I had just come back from the beach. So I was just in like bathers. I was just like, whatever. But that's what TikTok is about. And I think that's why TikTok is so successful. It's so rapidly growing because it's not curated. It's so raw. It's just like, hey, I just got out of the shower, but I really have to tell you this. Not that I do those videos, but whereas Instagram is very aesthetic, it's a certain look. But if you're thinking of getting on social media, just go for it. You won't know what works with your content unless you try and you put yourself out there. And some of my, I guess, videos I've done in 2 seconds when I'm about to leave the house, they're the ones that have done the best because I haven't overthought it. But I definitely think number one is having a niche. What do you want to talk about? What is your niche? Number two is focus on giving value. It's not about you, it's about them. What value can you give your audience? And then number three is be consistent with it. Post consistently, engage with your audience regularly. TikTok lives has really been a game changer for me. I've connected with the audience and built that. I answer questions on the fly, and then recycling that content as well, because people just want to spend time with you. They want to pick your brain, they want to learn from you, and keep it fun, keep it interesting and engaging. Put some music, put some songs, but stay true to your own style.
How you said that it's usually the ones that you get out pretty quickly that have made a splash, even though you didn't think about it quite often. How often do people, or how long do people generally need to spend on a video to make it feel like it's aesthetic, it's there, people are going to want to watch it, or does it not matter about that as much on depending on the platform that you're putting it on?
I think it depends. TikTok was short, sweet, quick videos, and I've sort of gone from 3-minute videos to 1 minute, and I try to keep them short and simple. But I think YouTube is more for longer videos. But now TikTok has uploaded 10-minute video length. So I think they're trying to step into that longer form video content. But it depends on what your end goal is at the end of the day. And YouTube's something I'm yet to sort of get on and harness that, because just it's too much going on right now. But I think it depends on your own style. It depends on what your audience vibes with. It depends on what your end goal is. I think that will dictate your content. What's your goal of this content? What's the purpose of me posting this? What do I want out of this? And I think that'll help dictate your content.
What is the niche that psychologists are benefiting in? So the ones that do really well versus the ones that aren't doing too well. Is it about sharing personal insights? Is it about clinical? Is it about strategies? Is it about do you notice that there's a theme in people who are doing well versus people who aren't doing that great?
To be honest, I don't look at a lot of other psychologists' pages because I don't want to compare my content. I just want to do me. But if we just talk in the general sphere of, okay, people doing well, doing not well, and I guess it depends on your metric. What is doing well for you? It may be, do you measure that by growth? Do you measure that by how many followers you're getting? Do you measure that by how many things you're selling? Because followers doesn't actually equal, sales at the end of the day, or following is more important than followers. Like when I had 3,000 followers on Instagram, they were really engaged. They loved what I was doing, versus there's people with 3 million followers who maybe may not have that level of engagement like that. So I think it depends on what your metric is. How do you know you're doing well? Is it how many podcast downloads you get? And I think you just don't want your content to be, I don't want to say the word boring, but it has to catch their attention. And you got to ask yourself, would I sit through this and watch myself? Would this engage me? And literally look at yourself. What would I think of this if I saw it, right? And would I be engaged, and would I enjoy this content? And I think the psychology space is hard because we're torn. We're torn between being a professional and being a psychologist and wanting to be authentic and yourself. And this is, I guess, a challenge that I constantly navigate, is because people on social media do want to work with you. They do want to say, hey, be my psychologist. And I have very strict boundaries with that. I don't see people from social media if I can control it. And I think what makes me unique is putting a bit of my personality in there, not being afraid to be a bit silly, a bit funny, a bit random, or dance. Whereas I think if you're trying to be super professional and this is my business versus this is my personal life, sometimes that can come across as a bit clinical, but people do it really well. There's a few psychology pages that do it really well, and they're just psychology. So I'm not saying you have to do that.
Okay, this is really good. Steph, you've been extremely generous with your time, and even though I'm sure there's a ton of other things we could pick each other's brains with, I want to ask you, is there anything that we've missed out? Anything that you want to highlight? Anything that you're like, hey, maybe we should have talked about this? What's your sense?
I think we've covered everything, to be honest. I really love this chat. We definitely went down some rabbit holes I wasn't expecting, and that's really good that we got to talk about it. And yeah, for anyone listening, just keep going. Know that your mental health is a journey, and it's something you got to work on daily. It's a system you got to put in place. And if you're in the space of psychology or psychotherapy, don't be afraid to do more than what you're doing. Start a podcast, start a social media page. I think times are changing and people want to learn outside of the therapy room.
I appreciate that. And if people want to know a little bit more about you, contact you, maybe have a chat or follow you on the socials, where are the best places to find you?
Yeah, you can find me either on TikTok or Instagram on Mind Food Steph. And soon I'll be actually releasing an app that I've developed. So keep an eye out for that as well.
Awesome. I look forward to to sharing that on my socials and going from there. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Stephanie, for coming on board and joining me today.
Thanks, Emil.